Welcome to the Daniel and Enoch podcast. I'm an engineer, Enoch is a pastor, and we're two men who love Jesus and long to think well about God and life. We've been doing a little mini-series about some of the stuff we're working on for our respective churches. Last week, we talked a little bit about spiritual disciplines. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about the breakdown of community. Breakdown of community is a strong phrase, Enoch. Do you think that's really the most accurate way to talk about this?
It's a fair question, Daniel. People have used a lot of different language to talk about the decline of relationships. Some people have used the term friendship recession. Certainly when we see trends related to romantic relationships and divorce, we talk about the breakdown of the family. Back in 1981, Journey sang about living in a lonely world. And we can banter and kind of debate what's the best terminology to talk about this. But from what we see statistically, almost every type of community organization, almost every type of relational trend is on the decline. So we're spending less time with each other in person. One of the most disturbing stats I've seen recently is actually related to young men, that 28% of young men in a recent survey described not having any close personal relationships. Older generations tend to say they're more connected. Younger generations tend to describe themselves as more lonely. So whatever language we want to use to talk about this, there are real problems in our culture today that we need to address.
So there's a lot of people doing studies on these sorts of things. How would you characterize some of the data that's coming from these studies?
One of the key sources that I've turned to here is Robert Putnam in his book, Bowling Alone. And he's actually writing in the year 2000. So we're talking almost 25 years ago now. He's documenting these trends that start in the 1960s that are really continuing up into today, related to the decline of community and social trust, the decline of relationships in general. So he's tracing these things farther back before you or I were born, Daniel, and really describing problematic trends that were existing back then. In the last 24 years, things have only gotten worse culturally. People have reported increasing loneliness. We've seen a massive spike in depression, and often related to the lack of social connection. Again, there's a lot of medicalized mental health situations that we experience today that seem very much connected and a result of the lack of deep personal relationships that these people are having. So Putnam talks about these trends, from the 1960s to the 1990s. We saw a significant increase in teen suicide, for instance. Well, since then, things have just gotten massively worse. One of the things that is very clear is that there is a massive expansion in mental health care, that whatever is going wrong, it seems like in some way our modern world today is hostile to us as people. There's been a massive increase in the amount of prescriptions for like antidepressants, for instance. Women tend to be even more extreme than men on these things. But at the same time, men report more loneliness than women report. And I think, Daniel, you and I have both seen people in our own context, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, who that very much applies to. So the numbers are stark, the numbers are discouraging, and Putnam and others really point out a lot of the challenges that we're facing here. Another researcher that would be worth noting is Jonathan Haidt. So he specifically talked about the loneliness and isolation, kind of the social factors of social media and phone use on teens. Mental health issues and loneliness seem very correlated with teen use of devices, for instance. And even, again, Putnam tracks this back to the development of television. So when television was first introduced, families watched television together. Since then, we've just become even more disintegrated in the type of shows that we watch. You're watching your show when you want. I'm watching my show when I want. We're all retreating to our bedrooms, watching our own stuff, and we're not even spending time together in front of a screen watching the same thing anymore. So a lot of factors, but the data is really discouraging no matter how you look at it, Daniel.
Well, let's go in that direction then. So it's one thing to say, here are the obvious symptoms, here are the obvious problems. But it's another thing for people to come to a consensus on the cause of these things. So, in some of your research and thinking, what are some factors that have led to this state of affairs?
There has been a significant withdrawal from public life in almost every way you can imagine. So why is that happening? One of the reasons that I've already hinted at is technology, the fact that we have personalized entertainment that we can go to and watch. Robert Putnam, again, writing in the year 2000, suggests that 25% of the social disconnection that we experience, we were experiencing at that time, can be directly attributed to the use of television in the home. The more television people watched back in 2000, the less time they were spending involved in almost any community organization. You and I, as people deeply committed to the local church, would be very interested to know that there is a direct correlation between engagement in both social media and entertainment and disconnection with the local church. The more television people watch, the more time they spend in social media, the less time they spend in person doing anything with people. So technology, media, entertainment, that's a significant trend that we have to contend with. Socially also, we're not doing as many things out with other people. Daniel, you benefit from remote work. I'd be curious to know how that has affected your social connection or lack of it in your world. But we have a world where people work remotely, where people can order their groceries, where people can connect with others online through message boards or through Reddit or something like that. And they never have to leave their home to go anywhere. And so we see very much people just not interacting with other human beings. COVID made this worse. COVID did not cause it. This was a pre-existing trend long, long before that. One of the things that I've just kind of personally noticed that's been interesting for me is the change in restaurants. So, Daniel, when I was a kid, and I know you did a lot of reading too, my family participated in the Book It program. My mom would take us to the library. We get all these books. You have to check off all these books. And Pizza Hut would give us a free personal pan pizza if we read all our books for the week or month. I think it was a monthly program. So, but if you look at Pizza Hut restaurants back in the 90s, and if you look at Pizza Hut restaurants today, it's the Pizza Hut restaurant where people used to come to eat together has now become the Pizza Hut Express, where people can take their food and leave. We see that specific trend. I talked about Pizza Hut. We see that with almost every other restaurant you can imagine. Takeout is really becoming predominant, and sitting and having a meal with somebody is really not happening as much as it used to. That trend also continues into the home as well, where just far fewer people are inviting each other over to have a meal or to have a conversation or just to socialize. So our houses are bigger than ever before, and we're less likely to have actually people in our homes than we ever have been before. I'm throwing a lot at you here, but there's a lot of different trends and things that have contributed to this.
Yeah, it does seem like a very tangled problem. I would assume that everyone has had some kind of experience in this area of encountering less people than you used to encounter in some circumstances. I was thinking about, you were talking about restaurants. I've read that Starbucks has been doing more to reduce the amount of seating and the comfort level in some of their establishments, because they're trying to discourage people from camping there, which is a on the one hand, a reasonable concern. You don't want someone to buy a $3 coffee and then hog your Wi-Fi for 12 hours.
Yeah, yeah.
But on the other hand,
I
it's
may
just
be guilty of that when I'm sermon prepping, by the way. So maybe sometimes I get more than a $3 coffee, but I often spend 5 or 6 hours in a day at Starbucks, and they're very gracious with me.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of wiggle room there for, particular people doing particular things, but it illustrates at least that we live in a world where you just encounter people less, which is interesting. You mentioned my job. The way it was when I started 14 years ago was you went to the main campus and you did all your training in person. And my organization has always had a really great telework program. But since COVID hit, they've done all their training online too. And that has been very difficult anecdotally from the people that I've talked to who come to the office, and they're trying to learn a complicated job, and they're asking me questions. And these are questions that I sort of learn the answer to organically because I spent a lot of time around my coworkers, even getting lunch and stuff like that when we're in the same physical place together. It also helps feeling like you belong somewhere and that what you're doing is important. If you get up, if all you ever do is get up and go to your bedroom and turn on that computer, there's this odd, spacey disconnected feeling that you get sometimes. So it's rough. And I'm an introvert, so while I don't want to lean too heavily into some of the pseudoscience around some of that terminology, I definitely enjoy some space. But even in those conditions, I've recognized that it may be my preference to encounter less people, but it's not good for me to go too long without having somebody over to my house or going out to dinner with somebody, or just to brush up on. I think we take a lot of our social skills for granted, but they are a learnable skill to be an engaging conversationalist, and it's a losable skill. So it creates a really rough situation the more we spend online creating these pseudo relationships. Well, it's one thing to kind of throw rocks at a culture that is doing the best it can, ? But how would you focus a little bit and talk about some ways in which the church has either contributed or more positively fought against these developments?
It's a question that I've spent a lot of time wrestling with, because ultimately I do believe that the community that God has given us in the local church is one of the best weapons and tools that we have to fight against the social disconnection in our culture today. And I think back to the time, even when I was a kid, within my living memory, I was a part of a Baptist church in northern Michigan, and that Baptist church had Sunday morning services, which included Sunday school. So you were probably spending 3 hours on a Sunday morning at church. Then you came back for maybe an hour and a half at night for a Sunday evening service. And then there was even a prayer meeting that happened on Wednesday night. So there were multiple touch points that the church would have and that a church community would have in a person's life every week if they were committed to that type of community. And my church right now, we really struggle to have people show up for even like 3 hours on a Sunday morning. We've been offering these things called adult Bible communities, essentially a Sunday school class. And it has been really challenging for us to get people to even commit to, like, again, that 3 hour segment, let alone, we don't have a prayer meeting on Wednesday, although we do have small groups that meet through the week, and we don't normally have Sunday evening programming. So in a sense, my church today demands less of people's time than the church of my childhood did. Now, I understand that you have to adapt to the culture that you're in, and you need to be able to learn to do effective ministry in whatever context you find yourself culturally. But I wonder if we've made the wise choice sometimes and just kind of We don't want to overschedule people. We don't want to have them constantly be at church. I'm not someone who believes that everyone needs to be at church every moment of their life or every time that there's an activity offered. But I also think that there are a whole huge group of people who probably should be at that prayer meeting rather than just watching Netflix at night, or probably should be at that prayer meeting rather than scrolling on their phone mindlessly for hours, which even I have a tendency to do sometimes. So I do think we have pulled back from people's lives in a way that I don't think is the most helpful. And again, I don't want to just make people busy and not allow them to serve their families or communities. But I think spending more time with God's people is part of the solution here. And it's going to mean that we don't necessarily do as many other things. So I think the church has withdrawn. And I think part of the answer is not even just being a part of the institutional church programming, but making time throughout the week to be with people from church, fellow Christians that you're committed to in a community.
So where do you think the line is between the amount of time that a person should spend in an institutional meeting and a point at which it's no longer an effective use of your time, right? Because I feel like we run into this a lot as Christians. It's like, well, reading the Bible is good, but if I read the Bible 24 hours a day and don't do anything else, I'll die pretty quick. And prayer and church and community. So, it's one thing to say how much people need to spend more time together in church, but what would you say is the goal or function, and how much church do we need to achieve that?
Whatever the answer is, it's more than the majority of churchgoers are committing to now. So one of the other trends, in addition to kind of pulling back other times in the week programming that we've seen, is that the people who do attend church and who consider themselves regular attenders of church are actually attending church much less frequently. I think I saw a stat recently that the average churchgoer is attending like 1.2 times per month. So that is a really, it is immensely hard to build any sort of relationships or community when you're only seeing people once, just slightly more than once a month. That is not how you build relationships. That is not how you experience belonging. Think about how you're spending your time overall and the fruitfulness of that, and then assess how fruitful it would be for you to attend a prayer meeting or to join a Sunday school class, or, I think both you and I would say participation in a small group regularly is kind of the basic essentials in terms of belonging, is a part of the basic essentials in belonging to a church. But I would say this, I think that most people would be served well by being more engaged in their church than they are now. Now, you certainly have those maybe 10% of people who really do show up every time the doors are open. And for that group of people, I might say something like, well, maybe it would actually serve you better rather than coming to the fifth activity at church this week. Maybe you should just have your non-Christian neighbor over for dinner and develop that relationship, invest in your community in some way. So I think the answer is different for different people, but I think for most people, the answer is we're not investing enough time with God's people specifically, and even in institutional activities at church generally.
It seems like at least one of the root causes is that Christians have detached the relational component involved in being part of a church from the services or programs that the church offers. A Sunday morning service is imperative. It's critical to the function of a church. But we also do things like Bible studies and things. And people are like, well, I already read my Bible, or I don't need to know this book, or I already understand this topic. But part of what the church is doing is not trying to give you information. It's trying to create opportunities for you to spend time around other Christians, which is one of the reasons why I'm such a strong advocate for the small groups, because it's a little bit easier to say, you are in the group and you need to find a way to fit this group into your life. if the church does like an 8-week Bible study on this, that can be really hard to make the effort to wedge that time slot in from whatever else you've got going on. And then knowing perfectly well that once it's over, your regular life is going to swallow up those time slots again anyway.
Yeah.
I made an interesting observation years ago. I was part of a church that used to take the summer off from small groups. And I had started tracking attendance data before that happened. And I noticed that the attendance was really, really low for a couple of months after summer ended. And just talking with some people in the small group, it's because that they hadn't made a habit of meeting together during the summer, and it became difficult to add that relational time back into their schedules.
No, I agree with you there. My group, the groups that I'm a part of, continue year round, and certainly some people, take vacations in the summer and we miss them for a week. But the truth is, we need Christian community as much in the summer as we need it in the winter. And I do think it's extremely important for us to have that regular ongoing commitment. One of the things I'm realizing, even as just we're talking here, Daniel, is that, again, as people kind of have retreated from their church commitments, or other parts of their lives have filled up in ways that, they're less frequently at church activities, it seems like, again, Sunday morning is the thing that a lot of Christians have kind of stuck with, at least on an irregular basis. But for a lot of people, that's the least relational thing that the church offers or does. And again, we should be hearing God's word preached. We should be singing together. And there is something, being present in church, as I've said before, is much different than watching online a sermon that's broadcast online. At the same time, unless you intentionally make that a relational experience, talking with people before or after the service, or just sitting in that chair after the service is over and having a conversation with the person who's next to you who you don't know, unless you intentionally make that effort, that experience of attending church on a Sunday morning can be deeply impersonal. And that's the last thing that a lot of people still have in their lives in terms of church commitment. And I want to hear your thoughts on that, Daniel. But one of the things that I didn't originally realize as a pastor, I just thought people were becoming less committed to their faith, less committed to the local church. That's why we're seeing this retreat withdrawal. The same trends are true of almost any social organization. Again, so Robert Putnam talks about bowling leagues dying in the 80s, 90s, and they're almost non-existent now. The last bowling alley within, convenient driving distance to me closed a few years ago here in West Chicago. And so it's not just the church that is experiencing this. We see these trends within the church, but it's the broader culture. There's fewer people who are volunteering, fewer people who are involved in moose lodges and the Elks Club and the VFW. A lot of these organizations are also experiencing that decline. And certainly people are replacing that time that they were investing in these communities with other things, but they're not apparently replacing it with other things that satisfy the relational, emotional needs that they have. Like, we're still becoming more isolated. We're still becoming more lonely. And so it's not good for us to withdraw like we have.
I observe in myself a sort of fundamental selfishness. And I read the Bible, and the Bible explains that that really is the essence of sin. Yeah. And, we live in a culture that is so obsessed with making things easier and quicker. And we all benefit from that impulse. I love a microwave. I use it all the time. Yeah. But one of the things that's happened in the church, I think, is that church has tried to adopt some of these almost to get rich quick schemes. We observed that people struggle with attendance, and so we try to lower the bar. Yeah. I was at a church once, and the way they would start a small group sometimes would be to pitch it as just an 8-week group. Yeah. And then in the leadership meeting, they would be like, okay, now the goal is to sell the group so that the people who commit to the 8-week group will want to keep going after the 8 weeks are over.
Yeah.
And at the time I was new and I was like, okay, I got it. But in retrospect, I thought to myself that's, I appreciate the impulse, which is let's try to get some people in small groups. But you are doing that in a way that doesn't really solve the problem that a small group is intended to solve. And so you end up creating these false expectations, and people end up coming and going because they don't really understand what the group is for, or at worst, they might even feel hoodwinked that you promised that this was only going to take 8 weeks of their time, and then now you're trying to get them to commit more of their time. Yeah. It's almost like that old beggar trick where they ask you for $5, and then once you give it to them, they ask you for $1. Yeah. Come back later on, in for a penny and for a pound. So, I always appreciate that sort of church impulse to try to lower the bar, to try to reach people where they're at. But sometimes we end up compromising on the essential nature of what we're trying to do as the church.
Yeah.
Some things are hard. Some things, the value of some things is in their difficulty. It's like if you want to run really fast, you'll never be able to run really fast by only ever running slow. Yeah. At some point, you're going to have to push yourself. You're going to have to strain those muscles. You're going to be sore for a few days. That's how you get faster. And when it comes to the kind of Christian community, the strength of community that we see, for example, described in the New Testament and appears frequently throughout church history, it's a result of a bunch of people trying really hard to make that community, to build that community and make it work the way the New Testament says it can work. Yeah. So we've kind of already sort of switched gears a little bit from the big picture to the small picture. Yeah. But, sometimes I meet people who are going through a tough point in their life. And I now, listening to some of those talks that you did, I now see that what they are wrestling with is this lack of relationships. But I don't think that some of these people realize that that's what they're describing. So I'm just curious, how have you observed these kind of macro tendencies in your own local context?
It's a great question, Daniel. But first, I want to respond and just say that my church practices 8-week groups. So you're attacking the current methodology of my church right now. No,
sorry.
It is. No, that's all right. It is. There is a tension that I feel about it, certainly. And I often find that people, once they start in their commitment to a small group, that the relational bonds that they forge there are sufficient to keep them there past that 8 weeks. And so, yeah, it's how much do you kind of concede to human weakness, and how much do you structure ministry in a way that just challenges that weakness at every point? Ultimately, I would love every person in my small group or in my church to be involved in a small group. And I think we're at maybe 50% now. I want to keep getting that higher. And so the majority of groups that I start in those 8-week segments do continue on afterwards. And I'm appreciative of that. But yeah, it's a challenge. It's something that I continue to wrestle with. And I appreciate the challenge in a good-natured way that you offer it for sure. Okay, so how have I seen the signs of this kind of disconnection, social breakdown in community within my own church context? I would say one of the deepest and most tragic ways that I did reference in one of the talks that I gave here is that my church has seen just a a significant amount of deaths of despair over the past several years. So I would say within the past 5 years, we've probably had 6 to 8 deaths of despair. So deaths of despair are related to either someone taking their own life or substance abuse, substance misuse, somebody getting some bad drugs, or to alcohol induced liver diseases. And so substance abuse leading to ultimate death there. So we've probably, and it's been, the vast majority have been young men. I mean, men in their 20s and 30s. Within the last 2 weeks, we had a member of our church who tragically lost their child. And we just had a service at our church to remember the life of this young man. And so that deeply grieves me. And that is very much connected to the disconnection we have in our culture today. Certainly the availability of very addictive substances is connected here. But early on in COVID, within a matter of 3 weeks, we lost 3 young men who were either had been a part of our church or who were children of people who are ministry partners, members at our church. And it's not an accident that happened right as people were withdrawing from each other during this season of COVID. And so that's one of the deepest things that I've seen that just grieves me so much is the lack of connection that young men have that is often related to despair and addiction. And it's been really challenging because a lot of these young men who were struggling and suffering had multiple men from the church, including myself, reaching out to them, trying to draw them into community. And when you're in a cycle of addiction, that's just really difficult to have that happen. So, yeah, that's one of the things that I grieve deeply. Another one of the things I would say, and we've already talked about how this kind of lack of friendship and connections seems to affect men differently than it affects women. I think something that makes me really sad is that, Daniel, the demographic that we represent, men in their 30s who are unmarried, is almost invisible in most churches. There are very, very few men who are like us, who are committed to their local church deeply. Not that they don't exist, but the percentage that we have in culture is not represented by what we see within our church communities, or at least my church community today. I want to change that. But yeah, there's definitely, I see all of these things playing out within my own church and within the community at large as well. I mean, I talk to people who serve on boards within the city of West Chicago, and they tell me that they can't find enough people to sit on their boards with them. Just the commitment to being a part of the broader world seems to be diminishing significantly. And yeah, I definitely see that in my context. How about you?
You know, when I was young, when my dad was at seminary, I remember spending a lot of time with all the neighbor kids, scrabbling around in the dirt and playing tag and whatever. And as I have grown up and I have started to try to build adult relationships, I've noticed that people often live really far away from each other. And so they pick a house based on some purely secular factors: price, location, schools, size, amenities. And then from there, they just pick a church that they can drive to on a Sunday morning. You know, that they can get there in a reasonable amount of time. And so it creates this kind of, it doesn't seem weird until you look at everybody on a map or something like that. And you're like, how did we end up here where the people in my church, I don't live close to the vast majority of them. In my current situation, I actually am very blessed to live with pretty close to a lot of people in the church, and that makes a huge difference. It's not it's an order of magnitude different in terms of how often I see them and how much time I spend with them, because you can do things a little bit more spontaneously. And so the fact that we often live so far from each other, it is a sign of prosperity that you have an internet and a car and the ability to make choices like this. But we often choose the people we want to be around, and those people are usually not the people that we live near. And the current church doesn't have a lot of emphasis on all Christians living close to each other.
Yeah.
And that creates a pretty significant a relational burden. There's people in my church that I really like spending time with, and I have to plan like 2 or 3 weeks out if we're going to hang out, because we both have stuff going on, and the drive time and everything else means that it won't just happen unless we put a lot of work into it. And I think, as I've grown older and I realize the value of relationships and the value of community, it's been easier and easier for me to do the work. Mm-hmm. But I encounter a lot of people who don't have they don't see the importance of Christian community the way I do, and so they're not willing to make those sacrifices, and then they suffer for it and they don't understand why.
Yeah.
Which is kind of sad.
Yeah, it definitely is sad, Daniel. And I would echo what you said a moment ago about the value of living close to people. I remember one of the books I read in preparation for the Two Talk series that I just shared was the book Family Unfriendly by Tim Carney. And one of the things that he points out is that some of the most vibrant, healthiest communities that he's observed are actually conservative Jewish communities who, because they practice the Sabbath, need to live in a neighborhood that's walking distance, summer, winter, fall, spring, walking distance to the community where, to the synagogue where they worship. And he talks about the fruit of communities like that, relationally, socially. You see a lot less alienation and loneliness in communities that are constructed in that way. And just on a personal level, there are 2 homes within my neighborhood that probably sometimes I'm spending multiple days a week visiting friends in their homes from my church in the neighborhood where I live. And I would say it probably took me, I've been full-time at my church for 7 years now. It probably took me 5 years to start to develop the type of relationships that I long to have at my church in terms of the depth and frequency of them. And a huge part of that has been living in a neighborhood with multiple friends. That has just made such a huge difference for me.
Well, we've been perhaps a little doom and gloom today. You're right. The data, when you can't throw a rock without hitting a study that's freaking out over some of the numbers that we're starting to observe, indicating the poor health of so many different categories of relationship in our society. But what do we do?
Yeah.
What do we do now? Where do we go from here? How do we begin to right the ship?
I think the biggest thing that we should note is that it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a lot of effort. We've gotten to the place that we are in terms of the loneliness and isolation and disconnection and culture by following the path that was the easiest path to follow. The path of living far away, the path of working remotely, the path of spending a lot of time watching television and scrolling social media. Those things are the things that our society has essentially chosen as valuable. And if we want different results, we're going to have to make different choices. So some of those choices are going to be more disruptive than others. Some of the choices may be related to traveling less. We may end up doing less things and belonging to less organizations and groups so that we can genuinely focus on being really present in one place. It might change the way we think about where we live. We need to stop watching as much television. We need to stop scrolling as much. If we genuinely want these connections, we're going to have to make the choices that are less convenient for us to do. So for me, practically, that means, okay, I'm feeling kind of lonely tonight. I'm kind of thinking I might watch a television show. No, I need to reach out to my buddy Matt, who lives one street over, and say, hey, would you take a walk with me rather than me sitting down in front of that television? It's going to mean that, that we spend more time with each other when we're not feeling like it. There are so many times, Daniel, when I have thought before my small group on Wednesday night, man, it would just be nice to sit at home and not do anything or just mindlessly scroll. Not doing anything often means mindlessly scrolling, let's be honest. And every time that I have said, yes, I'm going to be with these men, even though I'm not feeling like it, I have absolutely not regretted it. I've been thankful for every single time that I made that commitment. If we want more deep community, we have to put ourselves under the expectation of others. We need them to be expecting and demanding things of us. We need to have them counting on us. So part of what that involves is signing up to volunteer at things before you talk yourself out of it, making sure that they depend on you to actually be there in order for something to occur. And that's going to require proactive effort to make the commitment, even when we're not sure we want to make the commitment, to get it on our schedule so that somebody is expecting us to show up. It's going to be inconvenient if we want to avoid loneliness. It's not going to be comfortable if we want to avoid this social isolation that we've been talking about. There's an inverse relationship between convenience and belonging. The more convenience that we have and the less that other people expect of us, the less we're going to feel like we belong in those places. And Daniel, I don't have a huge hope that society-wide we can make this massive difference in community soon. I think ultimately we'll get to the point where people are going to be desperate enough that we're going to have to make some massive changes. But I do think within my local church community, and I hope within your local church community, that we can start to see some of these things shift and change. But it's going to be against the grain of culture, not with the grain of culture at this point. And it's just going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of commitment, and we have to be ready to do that.
So you've been talking about the things we can do as individuals, and cutting back on social media is a really low bar, I think. I don't have Instagram or TikTok or YouTube Shorts, not because I'm a good person, but because I watch my life drain away. It's just so easy to spend endless amounts of time on those things. But when we think about ministry, like the institutional church, what are some ways the institutional church can facilitate some of these relationships? I mean, you can obviously you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, kicking people out of the church unless they come to Wednesday night Bible study is not on the table.
Yeah.
But with those caveats, what are some things that the church can do to help people to lower the bar for people making those kinds of sacrifices and commitments to each other within the church?
Yeah. Well, I do think we should make it easier to be committed, but I don't think we should, and I don't think this is what you meant, but I don't think we should lower the bar for people. I think one of the things that we should emphasize is greater commitment, but also because we know how God has made us. He has made us for a relationship. Genesis chapter, 2? It is not good that man should be alone. I think we are going to have to demand more from people than what they're willing to give. But that doesn't mean we don't accept the person who's coming once a month or once a year. we eagerly want to invite them into the church as participants, but also be honest with them that if they really want the type of belonging that they're longing for, it's going to take more than once a month in order for them to experience that. So it's a very much a welcoming posture, but with for those who are increasingly committed, an expectation for more deep relational engagement. So we want to welcome anyone, but we want the norm in our communities to be deeper commitment rather than shallow commitment. So I don't think we can lower the bar. I do think we need to raise the bar in terms of what it means to belong. And also, I think we need to celebrate stories of people experiencing community in the church and being changed by it. I think we need to celebrate friendships within the church and highlight those and share those in a way that makes people eager to have what these other people have tasted or experienced. So, yeah, I mean, multiple times a year, churches would be well served to have small group signups where people can join and invest in groups. I very much am an advocate of weekly small groups rather than biweekly small groups, and that's still a battle that I'm fighting at my own current church, because I believe that frequency is essential if we really want to belong and be changed by a Christian community. So practically, I do think we need to keep the bar high, but also explain to people how a high commitment results in a healthier life that they could experience. So I think we can cheerfully advocate a high standard and welcome everybody where they're at, but point them into a place of high commitment.
Yeah, I think those are good. And you're right. You know, that was a poor choice of words on my part about lowering the bar, especially since I criticized that very approach earlier in this podcast. Yeah. You know, what I was thinking of is the difference in my own experience. You know, I have been a Christian for a very long time, and the Lord has done some stuff in my life, and I've had some experiences that have really impressed upon me the need for community. And so I find myself in a lot of places where people don't expect me to be, because I value community so much and I understand what the requirements are. Yeah. But I spend a lot of time thinking about, for example, single men in their 30s who they may or may not love God at all. And if they are Christians, they may not understand that the church is true church community is going to be messy by definition. And so they come in, they attend Sunday morning service, they're unwilling to go to somebody's house for dinner because that's weird, or they don't want to come out to the church workday because it's manual labor, and so they don't understand that there's multiple things that we're accomplishing here. And one of the most important is simply time together. And so when I say lower the bar, what I mean is, how does the church anticipate that some people do not yet understand the difficulty and challenges that are involved in Christian community, and make those things more accessible? You know, and one thing that I've encountered is simply the hospitable person. You know, it's one thing to say, to have someone say to you, hey, I go to this Bible study at so-and-so's house. It's another thing for that person to come to you and say, hey, a group of people come hang out at my house, and I would love for you to come spend time with us. Yeah. You know, it becomes the personal invitation from the host, or having a flat introduction. Makes a person feel invited to the space rather than allowed into the space.
Daniel, I'm reflecting on our experience in Arlington, Virginia, where I was probably the person pushing you out of your social comfort zone more frequently than happened opposite. We had our 2-bedroom apartment, and sometimes we had 30, 40, 50, 60 people who would come over for a party or a gathering at our place. And yeah, just the irony that I mentioned earlier about how we have larger homes than we've ever had before, and we show less hospitality in person than we have in a very, very long time. We just don't spend as much time in each other's homes. And I am convinced that embracing the biblical command toward hospitality is part of what is going to help us get out of this mess that we're in terms of social disconnection. And again, it's going to require discomfort, because people are going to see us in our own spaces in ways that aren't the most flattering, So I could pan the camera differently right now and show you some of the mess that's to my side right here. When somebody walks in, they're walking into, when they walk into your home, they're walking into a state where you are being, at least in some ways, vulnerable with them. And so I get the resistance to it, but I think that type of vulnerability is exactly what we need if we want the connection that God has called us to have. And also just learning to be okay with people seeing our mess, both literally and figuratively. One of the things that Rosaria Butterfield points out in her book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key, that both you and I have read, Daniel, is that she sometimes asks people to fold her laundry when they come over. So again, she has a very kind of open door policy, and it's like, hey, I'm working on this right now. I'm prepping the food. Would you mind, while we're waiting, just helping me with a couple of things around here? And a lot of us would feel very uncomfortable doing that. But again, I think being needed and being wanted and serving somebody else is one of the ways that we can create deeper community. So I think I would just challenge our resistance to having people in our own mess and showing hospitality. And I know you host groups in your home, Daniel, and you've hosted me when I visited. You will host me again this fall. But yeah, I think we need to reconsider the role that hospitality plays in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on, because there's that's such a fruitful field for consideration. I love the opportunity to host people, not because it is easy or cheap, but because I get to know people and people get to know me in a way that wouldn't happen if they hadn't seen what kind of place I live in.
Yep. Yep.
So sometimes, the most common thing that people say is, wow, you do have a lot of plants. And that's because when I told them I had plants, they envisioned a number. And then when they get to my house, they realize that the number is much higher.
Yep.
And so there you go. The experience of my house adds body to the things that I told them about myself. And they wouldn't have known unless they'd come over and saw that for themselves. Yeah. So it is such a valuable and relatively straightforward, I think, the effort of cleaning and cooking. Food is a great leveler. It's such a great opportunity. So, yeah. So I guess we should wrap it up here. We've been going for an hour, and if you watch to this point in the podcast, and if you'd like to share any stories down in the comments about people who've been hospitable to you, or the values that you've seen in communities, or any tips and tricks you might offer to a person who is feeling lonely or down and separated from people, feel free to put that below. We'd appreciate it.
And Daniel, I think I will just end by repeating something I said earlier. I am fully convinced that our best hope for breaking this pattern of disconnection is found in the local church. And so I would say this, I imagine most of our listeners, the people who know us at this point, are those who have heard us talk about our faith and our commitment to our faith. If you are a Christian and you're watching this or listening to this, I would say make your commitment to your local church deeper. Whatever that takes, think about how you could do that. Just what is that next step and increasing the commitment I have to that community. If you are a lonely person and you're watching this and you are not yet committed to a church, find a local church that you can visit and try to invest in those relationships. I often find that you may not even be convinced that Jesus is worth your time and attention yet. But I'm convinced that when we get around people who love Jesus deeply and who love us deeply, we often see the beauty of Jesus more deeply. And so, yeah, I would just, if you're one of these people we talked about who rarely gets out of their home, or who struggles to make social connections, or who works from home and orders their groceries delivered, and just take the next step of getting out of your home this coming Sunday morning, whenever that is, and attending a local church in person. So just give it a shot. See what happens. Take that uncomfortable step and see what God does. So, Daniel, before we sign off here, just a couple of book recommendations. I probably got 3 that I would recommend. The first that I've also already mentioned quite a bit is Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. This is a massive book. Again, it was written 24 years ago, still has a lot to share. If you're looking at data, if you want some more data about disconnection in our culture, I don't know any better place to go than Robert Putnam. Also, a couple of books that I think would be worth your time. And if you're thinking about friendship and a biblical vision for friendship, first of all, No Greater Love by Rebecca McLaughlin. This is a book that I've just found really helpful personally, even as I was preparing these talks that gave rise to this podcast. She points out that Jesus, when he talked about what the greatest love is, his illustration of the greatest love was not a husband and a wife. It was actually a man who lays down his life for his friends, or a woman who lays down her life for her friends. And there's a beautiful vision of friendship in here that I hope more people would be willing to read and check out. And then also Spiritual Friendship. Daniel, I know this is a book you appreciate, you have read, by Wesley Hill. The subtitle is Finding Love in the Church as a Celibate Gay Christian. So he's looking at some of the historic kind of friendship practices that we have within the Christian faith, and how fruitful for those could be in our modern context, both for those people like himself who experience same-sex attraction, but also for those who are just not in a marriage relationship in general. I don't know if you want to add any other recommendations of materials that people could check out, Daniel?
I really enjoyed this book called Reclaiming Friendship by Ajith Fernando. The subtitle is Relating to Each Other in a Frenzied World. And part of what I appreciated was that he is born and raised in Sri Lanka, and just having a perspective on friendship from a culture that's not ours, I thought was pretty interesting. Another one that I appreciated a lot was Why Can't We Be Friends by Aimee Byrd. The subtitle here is Avoidance is Not Purity. This one is specifically dealing with the topic of the friendship between people who could be attracted to each other. I'm going to generalize it. I think she's specifically dealing with men and women. And that's a very broad topic, and there's obviously a lot of risk there. But she's making the point that we have elevated a lot of romance and sexual attraction to the point where we pretend like that we're powerless to resist the things that we desire. And that has negatively impacted friendship pretty significantly. Yeah. Well, that's it for us today. Like and follow us on whatever subscription service you're using. We really appreciate the listen.